Chapter 1: Colonial Blueprint. With the exception of Ghana, 1957, and Guinea, 1958, most sub-Saharan African countries got their political independence in the 1960s. This was due to the struggle for independence in the 1940s and 1950s, in the so-called wind of decolonization. But what actually happened on the Independence Day in these countries? What happened on the night of December 9, 1961 in Tanganyika, or December 12, 1963 in Kenya? On the Saturday night of December 9, 1961, the following things happened in Tanganyika, and these things happened to all African countries on their Independence Day. There was a lowering of the colonial flag. In Tanganyika, for instance, the British flag was lowered to symbolize the end of British colonialism in Tanganyika. The new flag of the independent country was raised up. Tanganyika's flag for the first time was raised as the national flag of the independent country. This also happened across the board to other countries. Colonial masters' flags were no longer used after independence. There were big celebrations everywhere. African dances, wines, alcohol, food were supplied. There were inspirational speeches on national radios. People were united all over the country to mark such an important day in their lives. African leaders were seen as heroes. They were appreciated, celebrated, and adored by everyone. Children who were born on Independence Day or that year were given strong names. Others were given the names of their leaders. It was pure joy and happiness for so many to be free at last. Lastly, there was a handing over of the country to the real owners of the country. This was different from country to country. For those countries which got independence through peaceful means, like Tanganyika, there were some colonial government representatives to participate in the celebrations. They handed over some important documentation and signed some documents to officiate the start of a new era. They also supported the smooth transition of power to the local power, the citizens. It was vastly different from countries where liberation was through armed conflict and bloodshed. What didn't happen? Unfortunately, one important thing didn't happen on that night. If that thing were to happen on that night, I believe we would have a different Africa by now. The colonial governments in all African countries, before leaving, they handed over the colonial blueprint, or rather, a colonial template, to the new African leaders. And the worst of all, the new African leaders started building their countries in the post-colonial life, basing on the colonial blueprint given by colonial masters. In the simplest explanation, on the celebration of the Independence Day and post-colonial governments era, the new governments didn't completely demolish the colonial blueprint or colonial template. They started building a home, post-independent country, in the old colonial blueprint. It's practically impossible to build something of your own, to meet your reality while using 100% someone's blueprints. In other words, African leaders were supposed to demolish the colonial blueprint and draw a new blueprint to accommodate realities of Africa and Africans. The question I have asked many times is, what's the colonial blueprint? In order for a person to well understand the colonial blueprint, or colonial template in this context, we need to go to the basics of colonialism. This should start with questioning as to why Europeans traveled from their countries to come to colonialize Africa, and most importantly, ways which were used to make colonialism successful in its fully operational ways are the one referred to as the colonial blueprints. In layman's language, colonialism is a direct product of the development of capitalism. When capitalism reached the stage of industrialized economies, the huge demand of raw materials of these countries and manufactured goods forced such countries to expand their borders. It's a no-brainer that they had to expand to countries which haven't advanced in industries, and Africa in this context became the target by default. The overall cost of operations is very cheap in these countries, which would yield to the maximum profit. It should be clearly noted that the main distinctive feature of capitalism, despite its stage, is profit maximization. The capitalists look all ways to get maximum profits in whatever they are doing. It was practically impossible for Britain to go to colonialize Germany because they were both at the same industrial stage. That means manufactured goods from Britain would face heavy competition from local industries. But Africa would be a perfect candidate for colonization. There were no industries which would provide such competition when manufactured goods are imported to these countries in Africa. In the business world, when you have a guaranteed market with no competition from within or outside, you will be able to make maximum profits. One other important thing for Africa was extremely low costs of operations. Cost of labor was very cheap. Therefore, you get raw materials for a very low price, low cost of transportation, and in return, you would sell your manufactured goods for the high price to the same people. What a business! Does the size of colonial master matter? The map shows the size of Belgium and Congo side by side. In numbers, the size of Belgium is about 11,787 square miles, and that of Congo is 905,400 square miles. This implies that Congo is about 77 times bigger than Belgium. In other words, Congo is as big as France, Switzerland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, United Kingdom, Ireland, Germany, Andorra, and Denmark combined. In American perspective, Belgium is about the same size as the state of Maryland. Why such a big country like Congo accepted to be colonized by a very small country like Belgium? This is a million-dollar question. You might quickly rush into answering and blaming African chiefs like Chief Mangungo Msiwero, who gave his land to Karl Peters and Germans in 1885, that they were ignorant and uncivilized. The way African chiefs were played, manipulated, and outsmarted by Europeans before and during colonialism, it is still the same way. Currently, under the so-called globalization, Africans are outsmarted and agree to continue to be under neo-colonialism despite their geographical size, population, and capabilities. We all remember the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. It was the conference where African continent was sliced like a loaf of bread and divided on the table among the imperialist powers. They created the rules of the international community, which obviously favored themselves. And guess what? African countries had to accept decisions reached in the Berlin Conference. For instance, those early contracts where African chiefs signed with Karl Peters and others were considered as legitimate and legal contracts. It was practically impossible after signing to come back a few days later and say that you didn't know what you were getting into. In that scenario, African chiefs were completely knocked out, basing on technicalities. They ended up accepting that they willingly sold their lands, powers, and wealth to the colonial powers just in exchange for useless items like looking mirrors, clothing, sweets, and so forth. If you fast forward to the formation of the United Nations, the Berlin Conference, the League of Nations, and the United Nations are all of the same nature. They were created by imperial powers using their cultural values, but most importantly, to safeguard their interests, making sure that they are not going to fight among themselves at any point. After each African country became independent, joined the United Nations, the organization where rules of the games benefited major players, in this case, the creators. In any game, if you really want to play and win, you need to well understand the rules of the game. If you are just playing and you don't even know how to score, what is the normal foul, or what kind of foul play makes it a penalty, what formation you are playing, and most importantly, how many points you get when you win. All in all, Africans in the United Nations and other organizations and international communities are just there without knowing the rules of the game. Therefore, they are completely dominated and played. I usually don't get surprised when I see African countries are signatories of even things which don't make sense in their environment or context. A very vivid example is the International Criminal Court, ICC. The United States, China, Qatar, India, Libya, Yemen, and Israel are not members of the ICC. Unfortunately, many African leaders, scholars, and citizens see ICC as the only tool to target Africans. Why did African countries jump in and sign it when they see the United States refusing for fearing their leaders will be taken to ICC? Does that mean it's okay for other countries to be taken to ICC? Despite the movement of trying to leave the ICC, Burundi, South Africa, and a few other countries have failed to do so due to the process created beforehand. I believe this is one of the lessons for future African leaders before signing any contract to read the fine print and understand everything in the contract. There are so many bilateral agreements where Africans are completely humiliated and exploited. They just sign agreements and wake up when they are sued in the international court and end up paying penalties for ending contracts or change of anything. What is the International Criminal Court? The world's first permanent international criminal court was founded in July 1998 and went into force in July 2002 as an independent body governed by the Rome Statute as international treaty that established it. Who belongs? The court has more than 120 member nations, but countries that are not members include the United States, China, India, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Qatar, and Israel. The U.S. signed the treaty during the Clinton administration, but Congress did not ratify it. President George W. Bush's administration later opposed the court, saying it could bring politically motivated investigations and prosecutions of Americans, such as military officials. Russia signed the treaty in 2000, but like the United States, did not ratify it. I don't want to perceive this as racism until it becomes a major thing that comes up when you search if you want to hide something. See the results for yourself. We need to get into it and change it, otherwise it will continue and exploit Africans. International contracts have been and will continue to be a major avenue where Africans are completely owned by Western powers. Europeans used these contracts before the Berlin Conference and worked perfectly well on their advantage. And up to now, Western powers are still using these contracts and bilateral agreements to their own advantages. Unfortunately, many blacks and Africans, as rumors speculate, don't like reading books. With such weakness, you will find out most of these contracts have so many pages, technical language, lots of fine print, and most importantly, things which will protect them when they come to a disagreement with another African nation. When Western powers go for signing any bilateral agreement or contract, they always come fully equipped with expertise. They don't just flip pages and put their signatures to any contract. They will have experts in legal, economic, politics, you name it. They look at all possible angles, fine print, and everything but above all how such agreements and contracts are benefiting them and their citizens more than any other an African nation. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen very often to many African countries before signing contracts and bilateral agreements. Many African countries don't value expertise when it comes to things needed to benefit their citizens and respective countries, sadly. We have seen, even in the very important meetings, most delegates from Africa ending up having tea or lunch, but they don't take any notes at all.